to be here so I can hit the clicker. So we have some, for those of you online, we have some rearranging going on here in the room. So we'll give them a minute to get situated. Great. Well, welcome. And I always like to start off our sessions with just a little bit of an overview of where we've been so that we can make sure we know where we are and where we're going. We are looking at, throughout this 8-session series, it's divided into 2 4-part. The first 4-part, which we did in the fall, was looking at emotional and social intelligence. So we have self-awareness, self-management, awareness of others, and relationship management. So that was our fall series. And now we take that same framework of emotional and social competence, but we're now taking it in from a personal perspective into a professional perspective. And the way that it overlaps is when we talked about self-awareness, now we're talking about values and ethics for your profession. When we talked about self-management, now we're talking about roles and responsibilities. How do you manage yourself as a professional? And then getting to know others is interprofessional communication, and relationship management becomes teams and teamwork in a professional setting. And this fits, oh, let me go back here. Ooh, previous, there we go. This fits with the IPEC, which is the Interprofessional Educators Consortium, their framework of interprofessional education, which is divided into four main domains. And this is really where we're getting this from. Okay, so today we're on this lower left-hand corner. So this is the equivalent of self-management, but we're talking about it professionally. So we're talking about roles and professional limitations. Now, we kind of show this slide at every session because I think it's so important. Really, the whole series, if you kind of boil down this whole series to one word, it's stress. I usually ask, so we'll ask because we have some new people in the room today. On a scale of 1 to 10, what would you rate as your stress level?
Today, I would say it's a 3.
All right, we have a 3 for today, a 5. What is it usually? At work. Let's talk about at work. Yeah, what is your stress level usually at work?
Probably a 5.
Okay.
Standard 5. As we move through the spring, it's going to go towards the right on the scale.
Okay, so there's maybe a seasonality of stress.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, and seems to be that maybe during like that midterm and the finals week, we can move up into the
red zone.
Yeah, the red zone, the high stress zone. Yeah, and one of the things we've talked about is that, well, stress is good and bad. And this is one of the scales that we've shown before. When there's no stress in our lives, we become apathetic, we lose interest, and we lose passion. And that's not good. We need stress to motivate us to do things. So anytime you set a goal for yourself, let's say getting a degree or having the students gain their degrees, it creates some stress because it means you have to do something. You have to turn off the TV, get up off the couch and do something. And so when we're in that no stress zone, that's bad, and it leads to a low level of performance. Now, when we have those goals and we do introduce stress into our lives, it does compel us to perform. But if it becomes too much stress, then we hit the distress zone. So we go from no stress to eustress. Eustress is our good stress. We feel good, we feel challenged, but we don't feel overwhelmed. And then distress is when we're overwhelmed, we're tired. We start shutting down. There's a lot of talk in healthcare now about burnout. And so once you hit the distress zone, that's when you start seeing signs of burnout. Okay, so let's turn it to your profession. So what are some examples of, it could be either for you personally or people that you know in your profession, whether it's health administration, whether it's pharmacy and nursing. What would be an example of something that you've seen that is a no stress environment in your profession? People aren't doing much. They need a little kick in the butt.
No stress.
No?
I think coming back from the holidays or back at the, not so much in August, but coming back in January, and this is from a faculty perspective. We're back a couple weeks before students get back.
Yeah.
And there's really not, everybody's kind of rejuvenated from the holiday break. They've had some time off and they come back, and I don't think there's a lot of stress level that first week, that second week, and then it starts to peak up into the middle zone.
Yeah, so I think especially in education, we are kind of flowing with the rhythms of students. And when students aren't here, it's a little less stressful. Now, in theory, that's when you're trying to get your research done or other projects getting done. But yeah, I could see that there could be times when it's like, maybe it took you a little bit longer than that would have if the students were around, because you tend to be a little bit more efficient when they're in there. All right, so that's good that we can't think of many examples of no stress, because we are productive and we want to, especially we don't want to point out our colleagues, right, and say, well, this person doesn't get anything done, so they have no stress. All right, so let's talk about the eustress. What is an example of a eustress environment in your profession? When do you feel like your profession, it's going well? You're adequately challenged, but you're adequately supported?
I mean, as far as being a student, like usually during presentation times, like people tend to, even if they aren't always on top of it, like usually I've seen with the healthcare administration students, if it's time for somebody to present, like they just click right on, they're ready to go, they've got their slides up and everything. So that usually seems like a good stress environment versus a distress.
Yeah, so maybe a situation where you have something that you know you're responsible for, but there's clear parameters around it. You know what's expected of you, and it doesn't get changed at the last minute. It's not like, oh, we said you were going to do a 30-minute presentation, but we've rescheduled the class. You now have to present for 2 hours. Go for it. So if you can get comfortable with the stress that you have, that's a good example. Any other examples where you feel like, good, I feel like this is a goal I can achieve, feel comfortable? All right, well then let's talk about the distress. What is a professional example? Whenever you feel professionally like, too much, this is too much, I'm tail spinning. Yes?
If you count student as a professional, what you just said, the opposite for eustress, if the parameters change, the assignment dates, or it's not clear what it is that's expected of you, that can cause distress.
Yeah. What are some other examples?
Well, again, I think in our environment, as the closer we get, that space between midterm exams from a faculty and administrator and student perspective, that space between midterms and finals, the fatigue starts to set in, especially closer to finals week. The anxiety starts to set in, especially if there's any kind of changes. If there's tests scheduled and there's a snow day, we've had finals week where we've had tornado warnings, or
right.
I mean, those kinds of things. The unexpected can certainly intervene and cause the distress, and then just the long haul toward the end of that semester that you see fatigue increasing, anxiety increasing, and the distress increasing alongside that.
And not just the unexpected, but the lack of control.
Mm-hmm.
When, like the weather, where it's something you don't have control of.
Yeah, I have found that our students tend to like to control things. And when things change, they don't like that as much. Another thing I would point out is, and I've seen this from students, but I saw this when I was, in working in healthcare and even now as a faculty member, most of the things that we do now are team-based things. And something that causes stress is when somebody else doesn't do what they said they were going to do. And it's part of the lack of control because, okay, we divvied this thing out and I was going to do this, you were going to do that, but you didn't do your part. And so are you going to do it or do I have to do it? And that can be very distressful. So part of it as a profession, it's we can only control what we can control, but we are dependent on other people to a very large extent in healthcare, whether it's in an educational setting or in a practice setting. But the good news is that all this stress, if it's appropriate and it doesn't burn you out, stress is good. So we talked about this, I want to say in the fall, we talked about this concept of allostasis and how your body is kind of in this set point for homeostasis. And if you think about it, I think the analogy we used was exercising. So let's say you wanted to run a 5K. If it's been a long time since you've run, your body has this set point of homeostasis, which is in essence sitting on the couch. And it would not be good for you to get out and just run 5K. Your body would probably stop you before you hurt yourself, or you may just push through and hurt yourself. But if you challenge yourself to say, okay, I'm going to run for 10 minutes a day, next week I'm going to run for 15 minutes, and you just keep increasing that, this is what this image is showing, is that every time we give a allostatic load, or in essence stress, it increases our set point for homeostasis. So this is same thing professionally is when you were in school and learning about how to do your professional skills, probably seemed pretty stressful. And some of those things that were foundational that you were learning and were challenged with learning, now they are second nature to you because you have reset your professional skill point through introducing stress. So every challenge is a stressor, and every stressor produces stress, and every stress triggers allostasis. What you don't want is this huge gap where it's unreachable, because you actually don't set a new homeostasis point. You just give up and get defeated, and your homeostasis may actually go down because now you have some fear or you have some insecurity. So we want to introduce stress gradually, and oftentimes, so let's say go back to the example with working out, is you may want to coach, or you may want to go to a facility that has a program that's out there for you. So same thing professionally, there's so much to know in medicine and nursing and pharmacy and dentistry. I mean, there's all these things to know, and you can't know everything at once. So sometimes it helps to have a framework, somebody to help guide us to say, okay, here's your set point. Because a plan to get somebody to run 5K is different from somebody who's never run really in their entire life versus somebody who has run marathons before and they've just taken a couple months off. They just need to get back into it. So that plan is going to be much different from them, just like your professional plan will be based on what your needs are. Okay, so one of the things that we talked about as well is this concept of there's this space. Okay, so a stress, when we have a stimulus, or I like to call it a trigger, that'll trigger stress in us. So whether it's somebody not doing what they said they would do, whether it's a tornado, whether it's a new deadline that was just dropped on your desk, that stimulus is going to cause a response. Now, that response can go a number of ways, but the point here is that you can't usually choose your stimulus. I mean, there are some things you can do with your environments, like if you don't want to eat McDonald's, it may not be a good idea to keep driving by it. So you can change your stimulus by changing your actions, but a lot of times we can't change our stimulus. But there is this gap between our stimulus and our response, and we can choose our response. Most of the time don't do that though. Most of us operate on autopilot. And so this is what happens when, and I think we talked about this in class the other day, when somebody cuts you off in traffic, there are some probably proactive things that you can do, but often what we do is a reactive thing. We honk our horn. We're just communicating with the person, right? We're letting them know that, we're here and they almost ran us over. But what we're going to talk about a little bit today is, why does this happen? Why does this space between the stimulus and the response shrink down? Because we're very smart people, right? You're a smart person. You're a smart person. You think about what you do. But I think a lot of times we don't think about what we do. Have you ever had a situation where you did something and like almost immediately afterwards, you're like, what was I thinking? And maybe it's because you weren't thinking at all, which is okay. All right, and so mindfulness, what this series is about, mindfulness is about increasing this space. It's taking that gap between the stimulus and response, and through self-awareness, leading us to self-management. There was this one time I remember when we were at work, and this situation happened between two colleagues, and it was one of those things where it was like a group email, and one person sent a group email to the whole team, about 100 people, and another person responded talking about this one person, and he thought he was sending it to just one other person, but he replied to all. And so it wasn't good. We had to address it. There's two ways of addressing it. One way is to just react and say, wow, that was terrible. We got to deal with this. And without really thinking it through and thinking about the people involved and the situation, it's a reactive response. Instead, we wanted to do something that was more intentional. So I always remember our director, she said, well, we want to act, we don't want to react. And that's what mindfulness and self-awareness will allow us to do, is make a conscious commitment to create space so that we can analyze our next behavior and do it in a way that's productive. Okay, so let's kind of bring it back here to professionalism again. Is, now how do you know what those responses are? Okay, so we talked about the stimulus and the responses, because that's what ultimately what people will see. They will see your behavior. They will see what you say and do. So how do you know what is acceptable for you to do as a professional? What is called your scope of practice.
We have a practice act. Is that what you?
Well, explain.
So are we talking like technical skills?
Well, it's an open-ended question for a reason. Yeah.
Okay, so you have a set, from a practice act perspective, there are certain things that you can legally do in the practice of fill in the blank.
Right.
There's also professional behaviors that are expected of you as an individual. Those professional behaviors vary from person to person, and those are not as well defined in our scope of practice as the training, the technical skills that we're allowed to do.
Before I ask some follow-up questions on that, were you going to say something initially?
She pretty much covered it. I was thinking of professionalism in practice, which is what you were referring to. And that, gosh, it's almost like it's the unwritten social expectations, if you will. For example, as a nurse, even if your patient is screaming at you, you're not going to scream back. That type thing.
Yeah, okay, so good. So yeah, scope of practice is sort of what's considered like the official, this is what you, like as a nurse, you're not going to do certain things that are for the physician to do, or you're not going to do something that's for the pharmacist to do. Or as a pharmacist, you're not going to do something that's something for the psychologist to do. So we have these, I don't even want to say clearly defined, but we have these definitions of what scope of practice are. But then there's also this concept of practice style, right? So I'll give you the example, which is, so we have 2 kids now, and we had our kids in New York City. And in New York City, the C-section rates are about 75%. And because it's a very litigious environment. And what happened was our doctor, during our first pregnancy, he was going to be out of town for a couple of weeks. He was doing his big Italian trip. And he said, it's very likely that my partner is going to do the delivery. And what that means, not officially, right? Not officially, but what that means is it's going to be a C-section. But we were really adamant that we didn't want that. And so we really, really pushed and we advocated, but of all the patients that his partner saw, we were the only one who didn't get C-section. All other 19 patients had a C-section, because there's nothing that would call for that except for professional behaviors. And so I wanted to look at a couple of things. One of them is, are you familiar with the Dartmouth Atlas? So the Dartmouth Atlas will show practice variation throughout the country. And so it will show in pretty stark contrast that certain physicians, it primarily focuses on physician behaviors, but certain physician behaviors will be drastically different depending on where they live in the country. Bless you. Now, it's not a analysis of education. So let's say you have all these physicians who graduated from University of Oklahoma, and many of them probably stay in Oklahoma, but they may be all around the country. What they show is that regardless of your education, so you all went to the same medical school or you went to the same training program, once you start working in an environment, you start to behave like the people do in your environment. And that's not official, right? Because you have this scope of practice, and you're supposed to practice according to these certain parameters. And for the most part, we are talking about variation within scope of practice. But even within that scope of practice, there's a wide variance in terms of practice styles. And so they'll show in like I said, pretty stark contrast that, cesarean rates, or they'll show giving beta blockers after cardiac arrhythmia. I mean, it really is influenced heavily by the people that you work with. And there's not much because you talked about technical skills, and that has nothing to do with technical skills, because it has to do with influence and how we behave. There's this really interesting website, it's called scopeofpracticepolicy.org, and they do some policy recommendations for, I don't want to say increasing, modifying scope of practice laws per state. And they had this study from the University of Kentucky in 2018, and they looked at 21 clinical services, so obstetric care, endoscopy, skin procedures, and they expanded on family physician scope of practice. So here's what they said. They said that the scope of practice was influenced and increased the closer you live to an urban medical center. So improved clinical training, EHRs with clinical decision support, and telemedicine connections are some things that can help people in rural areas. But what's in essence what they're saying is that the farther away you live from a hospital or a medical center, the less you practiced according to, quote unquote, the top of your license. So again, this could be, let's say, a physician who graduated from University of Oklahoma Medical School, great medical school, of course. And because they're working in a really remote area, they're not doing things that their colleagues are doing who live here in the city. And again, same scope of practice. So that's really what we're talking about is, why is that? Why would somebody who lives further away from a hospital practice differently than somebody who lives here locally? What do you think would account for that? Resources, okay, explain.
Like what they have to work with, different tests they would be able to run based on what a clinic would have.
Okay, so yeah, so maybe one explanation is they have different resources. Maybe they don't have the technology or the processes that a bigger place would have. What do you think, what other reasons do you think would account for it?
They don't have community in the same sense that practitioners in a larger environment have. So they're not talking to others about, well, this is what I did and here's how I managed it. So that they don't have that community piece, that ability to interact in the same way that people who are in a metropolitan or urban area where there's more people to talk to have.
Okay, yeah, so maybe they don't have quite the learning environment as their colleagues who are surrounded by other people who are doing different practices. Yeah.
Would you call that confidence to a degree? Yeah. And I see it for both of those pieces, that if you've got that resource of, okay, well, if something doesn't go right, or you need to consult with someone about them, and then in the same sense, when you talk about top of your practice, well, technically I could do that, but I'm really not that up on it because I haven't been to a conference, haven't talked to someone, and so I see it as a little bit of confidence. Yeah, well, maybe we won't take that risk, if you will.
Yeah.
Don't have backup resources, don't have current knowledge.
Yeah, good examples. I don't know if the study mentioned the reasons why. It just did an assessment of it. But yeah, there could be a number of reasons, whether it's the resources, the community. So I wanted to use an example here. Now, this doesn't have to do with technical skills. It goes to the professional behavior. So there's a book that we will read in our health information systems class. It's called The Digital Doctor. And it's a really great story because it's a real story. A doctor from the University of California, San Francisco, who wrote this book, Dr. Wachter, wrote a book, and he was able to use an example from UCSF about a near fatal overdose. So a patient was given a 29-time overdose of Septra. And one of the reasons, I mean, there are a lot of things that happened. The physician put in the order, the pharmacist put in the order, the nurse gave the medication. All these things happened, you know, Swiss cheese model of error, all aligns. But one of the things that happened is the physician, who was a pretty new physician at the facility, she said that when she came on board, she had her official onboarding and all that official stuff. And we put patients first, quality, patient safety, all that stuff. But when she was on the floor working, all of her coworkers told her, you have to ignore all of the alerts. You cannot read them. You do not have time to do that. If you want to see your family, if you want to have a life, you can't read them all. There's too many. Just ignore them all. And she kind of knew that wasn't good. But she had to make a decision. And the decision was, well, do I read all these things? Or if I read them all, it becomes distress. It causes anxiety. It causes stress because then I'm working 28-hour days, right? Something like that. So she basically did what everybody else does, which is, I'm not going to read them. Just click through them. And there was a very clear warning that said this is like a 29 times dose over the normal thing. And, you know, do you accept this override? And it was like, yes, you know, because you just click the button and say yes. Okay, so what are some other examples in your profession when you're given information about how to practice professionally it's not official? You know, there's nothing in medical school that tells you ignore all the alerts in the EHR system. But there are all these things, just like you talked about earlier. It's there might be a value statement that says you respect patients, but there's nothing that says specifically if a patient is talking about this thing, this is how you need to respond. But over time, you learn how to do those things. You learn how to respond appropriately. But let's just have a little dialogue here. What are some examples of this ignore all the alerts in your profession?
Are you talking about one specific thing?
Yeah, so okay, I'll give an example. This is unofficial. As a healthcare administrator, everyone is the same, right? There's no one who's more special than the other. But let's say there's two people sitting outside your office, and one of them is from the, let's say they're from the parking office, and they need to talk to you about a parking policy that's not going well. The other person who's out there is your top neurosurgeon, and they have a complaint, and they need to talk to you about it. They're both employees, and they both are equally valued by the organization, but who are you going to talk to first? What was that? Yeah, you know, it's, so the saying is that everyone's equal, but some people are a little bit more equal than other people. And that's not official. You're not going to put anything on your value statement that the people who drive revenue in the organization get more attention than the people who don't. But it happens. And it happens because you want to make revenue for your organization, you want to keep your job, you want to treat all the patients, and that means making sure we have money to be able to treat all these patients. And we're not going to have a parking problem if there's nobody here because we've lost this neurosurgeon. Okay, so that's an unofficial thing, that you give more time and attention to people who are more important fiscally to the organization. So like, what's another example of these things that, I mean, nobody tells you? There's nothing that's written in the code of ethics for healthcare administrators that says this, but we all kind of know that that's what happens. Any examples?
Well, so again, unofficially, but in a healthcare environment I've worked in, just not being the person who bothered to put away materials being used, or, you know, made sure, like, you know, spaces were cleaned up or converted appropriately, wasn't something officially anyone was told to do, but it was strongly implied that being the person who bothered to go around the room and clean everything up could impact your KPI numbers negatively, and have everybody else, you know, who interacted with patients for different levels of, you know, care, have a bunch of, you know, stuff appear on their KPI that wouldn't appear on yours, and then your numbers would be impacted negatively. It could hurt you to be the person who was making sure the space was well maintained and taken care of. And it wasn't officially ever said, but there were instances where somebody would say, don't focus on that, focus on something else, even when the environment became, you know, unnecessarily dangerous.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples here. Like, I'm just going back to health administration. That's my area. Is you may have somebody who they believe very strongly that you should never have a meeting without an agenda. And if you show up in a meeting without an agenda, they all of a sudden now feel like you're unprofessional. There's nothing official that states that you have to have an agenda for a meeting. But we just have these ways of acting, and we tend to treat one another based on our perception of what we think is a good professional. You know, we might think, as an example, we might think that you need to be the first person in and the last person out. Like, if you're not the most dedicated employee, then you're not the most valuable employee. That's not written in any HR policy that you have to be there when your boss is there. But depending on your boss, that could be a real thing. Okay, so let's talk about how do we bring some mindfulness to all of this stuff. And look at this guy. This guy's relaxed. So this is how you do it. You just lay out prone on your desk, and he looks like he's doing fine. His stress level is down to about a 0 now. He was at a 10, now he's down to 0. So we can't do that. That's not good. But how do we bring a sense of balance? And, you know, I'm going to talk about yoga. It always happens that we're going to talk about yoga. And look at this. This guy's zenning out. He's not being productive, mind you, right at this moment, but he's preparing to be productive. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of different tools or some concepts that might help us to think through these things. And I just shared this with my students the other day. Is to me, I think one of the things we can do is kind of look at it from, I heard somebody once refer to these as the killer bees of behavior. So we have bodies that influence our brains, that influence our behavior. And what I'd like to think of is when you're trying to change behaviors, so let's say not ignoring all the alerts or not coming in late to work all the time, often we try to hit that behavior directly, but it almost never works. Instead, what I encourage people to do is work backwards to find out where in that chain of events the things went wrong. Okay, so if you want to change behavior, work backwards. And so you start with the body. And if you start with the body, we talked about this, I want to say in the first or second session, is that the body and the brain are really intricately intertwined. And so probably the best way to change your brain, which directly influences your behavior, is to change your body. And we talked about this concept of our issues are in our tissues. So let's say you're feeling fearful about a meeting or a presentation that you have to give. You know, sometimes you say something like, oh, I mean, I'm really scared. And then someone's response to you is, well, don't be scared. Like that, how helpful is that? Or when they say, oh, I'm really stressed, and they go, oh, don't worry about it. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay, now I'm not worried about it. Yeah.
You can actually increase the stress because it makes you feel dismissed.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what's a more appropriate response if somebody says, I am feeling very stressed right now?
I can see how this situation would make you stressed.
Yeah. Well, it's giving some acknowledgement to it. And it's maybe encouraging them to say, well, can you be more specific? Like, you're feeling stressed. Are you feeling nauseous? Like my son gets, you know, those like butterflies. And I kind of know, like, there's times when he'll call me from school, or he'll be at a practice and he's like, oh, I have a stomach ache. I'm always like, what's going on? Like, it's a stomach ache for him is very rarely because he ate something. It's usually because, oh, there's a lot of people here and, you know, I'm not sure what's going on. And because it's almost guaranteed. Like there was this one time we brought him to basketball practice and he was nauseous and he was about to die, his words. And I called my wife and I told her what was going on. And she said, oh yeah, you know, I'm making burgers tonight for dinner. And she's like, maybe he won't want to eat one. I'm like, he is going to be fine. I said, no, don't make sure you make one for him because he's going to eat it because he's going to be fine. Sure enough, we got home and he didn't have a stomach ache anymore. It was amazing. He healed up because he wasn't in that environment that was causing him physical pain. So Grace, when she was here in October, she brought up this concept of regulate before you communicate. So we often think of communication as this mental thing that we do with one another, meaning I have some thoughts in my head, I'm sharing them with you, you're sharing some things with me, I'm hearing them. And often what challenges us in terms of effective communication is that we haven't regulated ourselves. So that means you're trying to tell me something, but I'm not listening because I'm distracted. Or you're trying to tell me something, but I'm really stressed about a deadline I have coming up and I'm not listening. There's a theme here, which is that until you address your own self-regulation, you can't bring your best self to communication. Okay, so you regulate before you communicate. And the best way to regulate is through awareness. Okay, so it starts with noticing sensations, noticing feelings and emotions. I once heard this really great description. They said, you want to think like a scientist. So the things that are happening, so let's say going back to the example of my son, like, what is it? Is it that he's actually dying? Or what is he feeling? What physical sensation is he feeling? Or what mood or emotion is he experiencing? Yogi Berra, the great philosopher, he said, you know, you can learn a lot by observing. Or no, he said, you can observe a lot by just watching. And that's what we want to do with our bodies, is we want to just notice. And then you notice them, and then you name them. So I tend to use this mantra, if you will, pretty frequently, is notice and name. So if you feel nervous about something, and you'll see this oftentimes with, we do this intuitively with kids, and then we kind of forget to do it with ourselves and with adults. So if you have a child, for those of you who are parents, if your child comes home and they don't look like they're happy, and you say, what's wrong? You're like, nothing. Okay, well, let's get more specific. And they might say, well, I'm not feeling, you know, I'm sad. And almost always the next question is, can you be a little bit more specific? Like, why are you feeling sad? You don't just say, oh, you're sad? Okay, I get it. You're sad. Like, good. You want to get at more specific. You know, are you feeling depressed because your friend left school? Are you feeling maybe nervous that you know, have this new teacher that you're not sure about? So you want to have your child get a little bit more specific about what he or she is experiencing and feeling. And that's what you want to do with yourself is, I like to use example a lot of hunger. So people will often say, well, I'm hungry. Well, what do you mean? Are you bored, meaning you just want to eat? Or do you want to go hang out with somebody so you're kind of lonely and you want to do something? Or are you lightheaded and are you going to pass out, like you're physically hungry? So are you emotionally hungry? Are you physically hungry? Because they're very different things, and based on what you're experiencing, your actions should match to fulfill that need. Okay, so you've noticed kind of these sensations in your body and you've named them. So now, because this is what happens is, and your brain almost does this automatically, and often that's not good. So as an example, let's say it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Your brain might tell you that you're hungry and it's time for afternoon snack or time for afternoon coffee. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having an afternoon snack or afternoon coffee at this regular time. Our body does like routines. But we're just trying to bring some awareness to it. Like, why are you doing that? Same thing professionally. Like maybe you think that, okay, we just had a meeting. We needed to have minutes done. We need to disperse them out to everybody, or we need to get them out to people by 48. I have this rule where you got to send minutes out 48 hours after the meeting. I mean, why? Just ask yourself, why do you feel that way? What feelings would you have if the minutes went out a week later? What stories are you telling yourself? So another little framework that I like to use is, it's called need, wants, and should. So let's go back to that example of being hungry. So you want to ask yourself, through observing your sensations and your feelings, there's a very different thing between saying, okay, I am feeling like I have a headache, I'm starting to shake, I need to eat something. Especially, let's say if you're like diabetic. Like I had a diabetic roommate in college, and I had never lived with anybody with diabetes. And I remember like literally the first night that we were on campus, 2 o'clock in the morning, he's up and drinking a Coke and eating a Snickers bar. I'm like, college is awesome. But I was also like, I'm tired, like I'm trying to get some sleep. But he was like, yeah, my body needs to eat. And he's like, I don't even like doing this. Like, I don't want to have a Coke and a Snickers bar, but I need to. So there's definite times when we know from our bodily sensations that we need to eat. But often what happens is we want to eat. And you have to be able to distinguish that difference, right? Like I will often, and this is why advertisement works so well. You ever see a commercial and they're showing something really yummy and you're like, wow, okay, let me have that. So maybe another example is, have you ever been in a situation where you told yourself, okay, I'm going to be good. I'm going to go to this party. I'm going to have maybe one cookie or whatever it is. I'll have one piece of cake. And you get there and, oh man, people brought some really good stuff. And you end up eating more than you thought you wanted to. But at the time, you want more cake. So you do it, as opposed to needing more cake. Nobody really needs cake. But anyway, it's always a what. All right, then the last part, and this is the part that's, I think, most difficult for us to tap into, which is we often have this feeling that we should eat. So I don't know if you remember from last month when Katie Elliott, our dietitian, she talked about how there was this I forgot who it was. Maybe it was Dr. Oz. I don't remember who it was. It was a very famous physician who's into this health space. And he was on, I think it was maybe the Ellen DeGeneres show, or a very famous show. And he in essence said that we shouldn't eat breakfast anymore. Like, it's not good for us, no breakfast. And so he's trying to change the dialogue, because I think for most people, when they wake up in the morning, they have this feeling that they should eat breakfast, right? It's the most important meal of the day, apparently, as we've been told. So we may not be hungry. We may not need to eat. We may not even want to eat, but we've been told that we should eat. Or another very common one is, after you work out, what do you typically do in terms of eating? Anyone? Yeah, like, I mean, even like, if any of you have ever done anything like a race, there's always food at the end. It's kind of weird. Like, you just ran and now there's like pancakes and bananas and all these things. Or so it's very, very common. You'll see this like in the gym, as people will work out and they're drinking like a power shake in the locker room right after they worked out, because there's this general feeling that right after you work out, your body just expended all this energy and you need to replace it with protein. So we have a lot of these shoulds. And so, I think it works the same way professionally. There's a lot of times there's things that we need to do professionally. We need to see that patient. we need to talk to this provider. We need to call the family. There's a lot of things that we need to do. That's our job. There's also a lot of things that we just want to do. And they could be good or bad. We may want to have another conversation with this person about what's going on with this person, but we don't need to, but we want to. And sometimes it's productive, sometimes it's not. And then there's the third level, which is sometimes we feel we should. And those are kind of things we were talking about before. Like we should be at the office because everyone's here and I'm not doing anything, but I can't leave. Or I should go to that party. You know, we're having this party to celebrate somebody in the department, and I don't really even know this person, but I don't know, everybody's going, I should go. You don't have to go. You don't need to go. But sometimes we feel we should. So part of this is understanding the distinction between when we need to do things, when we want to do things, and we feel like we should do things. Because ultimately what happens is our body takes all these things, all this bodily sensations, and it turns them into stories. So there's this new book out there. It's a really good book. It's called Data Story. And it's about this combination of how data combined with story is what motivates our actions. And so one of the things I liked here is that, you ever heard that saying that data just speaks for itself? And the author of this book, she says, no, it doesn't. It needs a storyteller. And that's what we do. So we have all this data, whether it's a physical sensation, a feeling, an emotion, and our brains are our storytellers. And they basically take all that information and they say, oh, yeah, here's what I think about it. Because, and you've seen this in your own experience. You can take, let's say professionally, let's say you're, it's a Monday morning and you go into work, you're expecting something. You all kind of talked a little bit about change. So, you know, you go into work thinking, here's what's going to happen this week. And then first thing Monday morning, something happens and it's a big deal. So you need to kind of scrap your plan for the whole day and work on this thing on Monday. Some people, they take that trigger, that stressor, that allostasis implementer, they take that and they get immediately overwhelmed. And their story is, like when things go out of control, I don't like it. And this is not going to go well. You know, we've had this happen before and I know I'm not going to sleep all week. And, you know, I've got to go do something for my family because, you know, I'm not going to be home all week. You have another person, they're like, oh yeah, this happened last week. Like it kind of happens every Monday. So no big deal. We'll get through it. And that just shows like the way that our brains will frame the situations that happen to us. But we can change that. You know, we can, through practice, we can change the stories that our brain tells about the data that we experience. So let me see here. Okay, so finally, it gets down to our behavior. And one of the things, remember Dr. Phil? I think he still has a show, right? So Dr. Phil, he'll often have these people on there, and they're always kind of very interesting people. And they explain something, and he kind of asks them, like, why are you doing that? So let's say he's got a, you know, I don't know, let's say he has a 13-year-old who constantly runs away from home. And he'll say, explain yourself. And they explain, oh, my parents do this or this did that. And they explain why they're running away is trying to achieve some sort of goal. Maybe they're trying to get attention, or maybe they're trying to bring their parents back together, whatever it is. And then he'll almost always go back and say, well, how's that working for you? Like what you seem to be doing doesn't seem to be working. And he's often asking them that question so that they go back and say, oh, I guess it's not working. We just had this conversation, and I'll get to it, the slides in a second. So actually, let me leave that for a second. So just remember that point there, because the slide's coming up in like 2 slides. But I also think we can turn it around the other way as well, is what is working, what is positively working for you? So let's say you do organize your meetings and you have agendas and you send out your minutes. You know, what behaviors do you do professionally that are successful? So keep doing those. It's not always looking at things that you want to change. Sometimes we need to just remind ourselves that we're doing some things well. This whole chain of events is working well. Right? We have a trigger, our brain interprets it, and our behavior is positive. So that's great. So that's basically the question. How's that working for you? If it's working well, keep doing it. If it's not, stop. All right, so one of the things that I love about yoga is it can help us build stress resilience. And one of the ways that we do that is that, let's say you have a regular practice. So it could be yoga, it could be karate, it could be boxing, kickboxing, whatever it is. One of the things that's nice about a physical practice is that it forces you to face different situations. And whether it's a different opponent in a ring, whether it's a different pose that you're not used to, but our body really likes two things. It likes novelty and repetition. So it likes novelty because we want to do different things. And then over time, as we practice that thing that's novel, it becomes easier for us. And then our body starts looking forward to it. It's like, oh, that's right. Like, I know how to do this. I feel confident in this. But again, if you keep doing that, you hit that no stress zone. So novelty will get us to that point of hitting eustress and then cycling back. So anyway, yoga is really nice because you get yourself put into these positions that you're like, I don't know if I can do this. It's stressing me out. And maybe you won't do it very well. And then maybe over time, maybe over long periods of time, through patience, practice, you learn to develop mental and emotional resilience. Okay, so one last thing here is about, yoga is full of these philosophical thoughts. And the very first thought in all of yoga is no harm. Don't harm yourself or others. And this is very similar to the Hippocratic Oath, right? Which is first do no harm. So as we talk about mindfulness and awareness, one of the things that we can do for ourselves is don't make things worse. Sometimes when you're faced with this stressor, and you probably know people like this, it's just this little bitty thing and it just sets them off and it becomes this avalanche of disaster. It's like, well, it was actually just a little bitty thing, and part of the problem was you kind of made it worse. So first, do no harm. Okay, so let me go back to that example I shared before. So I talked before about, I'm calling this little episode Lightgate. Remember Lightgate? So this is when my kids were turning on all the lights, and I finally decided, I'm like, I'm just going to let it be. So I have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old. So for not quite 11 years, but let's just say like 7 or 8 years, I've been living in this situation where they leave the lights on in the house, and I'm always going back and turning all the lights off and remind them to turn the lights off. And so going to that point before about like, if Dr. Phil would have asked me, well, how's that working for you? It wasn't working, all right? Clearly nothing was gonna change. So I just decided one day, I think I was preparing for the Mindfulness Session number 2 about self-management and how we need to control our behaviors. And I said, I'm gonna use this as practice. So from that day forward, I have not reminded anybody about lights, and I don't turn off any lights. And, I might turn off a light at night if they're all asleep, whatever, but I don't like go into the room and like look at them and be like, you see that? Like, just like that. So I don't do that anymore. And so the reason I bring this up is when it comes to changing our behaviors, kind of going through that chain of events, probably the best thing we can do is identify situations that happen to us consistently. So let's say as an example, let's bring it back to a professional example. Let's say you say, I really want to learn how to negotiate salary increases. Okay, that's like something that's going to happen sporadically. You're not getting a raise every day. I hope. Maybe you are. That'd be great. But that's like a time-specific skill. Instead, what I would encourage you to do is find situations that happen to you very consistently. So maybe as an example, there's a colleague who just rubs you the wrong way. And every time they have a conversation with you, it makes you feel defeated or makes you angry or something like that. But it happens pretty consistently, maybe a couple times a week. That is your opportunity for practice. There's a pretty common saying, whether it's in yoga or working out or doing anything where you're trying to transform yourself, and that is that a strong practice is a consistent practice. Consistency is really the most important thing. So even think about like if you're trying to diet and lose weight, it does you almost no good to just like fast for a day and then eat Doritos the next day. Well, that didn't work out. What's most important is being consistent with what you're eating. You can almost eat anything, and people do. There's like people that eat whale blubber all day long. There's people who eat snakes and scorpions all day long, but they're consistent about it, and their body learns to adapt. So your body will adapt to consistency. So that's a key part, is being consistent. And the way to be consistent is to find something that you do very frequently. So, it's one thing to say, well, I'm going to start being nice to my Aunt Margaret. You see her once a year. Okay. That's not going to really help your dealing with anger and frustration. Instead, it might be, I'm going to be nice to my daughter or my spouse or whatever it is, to someone that you see regularly. Okay. So that's a key part, is do it consistently. Because what you want to avoid is you want to avoid these situations where you're cramping. And so from a physical standpoint, it's actually kind of weird. We don't really know what causes cramps, but the general consensus seems to be that cramps happen when you just overload your muscles. You're having them do things that they're not used to doing regularly. So the way that you avoid cramping, let's say in a time when you don't want to have a cramp, let's say you're gearing up for a significant event, the way you avoid cramping during that event is you slowly increase the load so that it's going to simulate what's happening at that event. So I like to think of it, that's physical cramping, but we have emotional cramping. We have social cramping. Like when you're in a situation and something happens, you're like, ooh, I have no idea what's going on. And you respond in a way that it looks just like a muscle cramp. It's like a spasm. And it's like, why did you say that? I don't know. And so the way that we can avoid that is to do the same thing we do physically, we do it socially. So you put yourself in scenarios or simulations or situations where you have to practice the thing that you're trying to work on. So let's say you're trying to work on your anger. You put yourself in a situation where you get a little angry and you deal with it effectively. So every time you run from that anger, you're not developing your skill, and your anger muscle is atrophying. Same thing. So, we can take this to professional contexts. Is every time you want to have a productive conversation with somebody, you have to do it in low stakes first, and then slowly increase the stakes to where it's going to simulate an actual environment. Okay, so there's we like to do what I like to call embodied practice at the end of these sessions. And I thought about it, and I thought, okay, well, I don't want to have everybody like yell at each other and then start dealing with that. So we're going to do instead what is, I call it a behavior awareness worksheet. So I'm going to pass these out, and we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about the worksheet, and I'll give you some time to think through situations, and then we're going to complete the worksheet. At the end, we'll have a time for if you want to, you can share your experience. So I'm going to hand this out. So what the behavior awareness worksheet does is it gives you a framework for assessing, remember that little chain of events, your body and your brain and your behavior? So in an ideal situation, this is what would happen. Let's say you're at work and you just had a very tough conversation with somebody and you're not feeling good. Primarily about what you did. Maybe you spoke discompassionately to this person, maybe you yelled at this person, maybe you disregarded them, maybe they needed to talk and you weren't listening. So the idea is you would have this behavior worksheet, and right after this event happens, if you can, right after the event happens, you go through the worksheet and you say, what was happening 2 or 3 hours beforehand? What was happening about an hour and a half, or I'm sorry, half an hour to an hour beforehand? What was going on right before? And then as this thing was going on, let's say the person came to me. So right when it started with that trigger, what happened during this triggering process? And then of course, in the middle of it, while it was occurring, and afterwards. Okay, so let's just look at those first. Don't look at the last sheet yet. So you can see that all of these questions tend to be pretty similar. So what it's looking at is, what was your situation? What was your environment? Were you sitting down in your office? Were you walking through the hall? Because it could be very different. If somebody had a scheduled meeting with you and they wanted to talk to you about something, that could be a very different way that you approach it versus somebody saying, you're walking out the door, you got to go pick up your kids, and they're like, oh, by the way, I got to talk to you about something. Yeah, that's a very different situation. So you could be heading out the door, or you could be sitting at your office waiting for this person. What were you thinking? Maybe you're anticipating this conversation, maybe you're not, maybe you're thinking about something else. What are you feeling emotionally, and what are you feeling physically? Where are you? What time is it? Who's with you? Because that can all affect it. All right, so here's what I would encourage you to do. Think back to the most recent time. Okay, so now we're not looking back and we're not trying to find the worst situation we've ever had. Because we're trying to rely on our memory, is the worksheet, the best way it works in real life is you do it right afterwards. So we don't have that, but what we have is we have our most recent situation. So think back to the most recent time you did something that you wish you did differently, and work through the worksheet, just those first 2 pages. Spend about 5 minutes or so. 2 more minutes. Okay, so, and by the way, I have some extra copies if you want them, and I can send you this via an email if you want to have this with you. So let's dialogue, if anyone feels comfortable. And what we're looking for here is, do you notice any themes? You know, do you notice that you were like, oh yeah, I noticed I was in my car driving to work, and that's always a bad time for me. Or maybe it's, I just got home from work and, you know, my partner wanted to talk to me about this, but I need time to deep breath. So anyway, we're just talking about, what did you notice after going through this little mini reflection? Anything stand up?
So in this particular instance, I had a respiratory infection for about 3 weeks, and also having issues with an elbow, and that I know that when I'm not at my, which both of those things affect my energy level, my mental capacity, my emotional capacity, when I'm in that space, that's when I'm more likely to react rather than act or respond. And so I'm aware of that, but working through this validates and reinforces that it's an area that I need to continue to practice.
Yeah. Good, good. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Anyone else? Well, I'll give you an example. So it's interesting. So when we first moved to Oklahoma, I stayed at home with my kids, and so for like 3 years, I was a stay-at-home dad, and my wife travels a lot. And what would happen is she would come home from a trip. So let's say she was gone for like 3 days, and she'd come home, and it really ticked her off if right as she was walking in the door, the kids asked her for something. You know, instead of like, hey mom, you're back. Hey, you're like, I'm hungry. It's like, okay, like, I've been gone for 3 days and that's what I get. And I always thought it was just interesting. I just observed it. I was like, okay, you know, I get it. I get it, right? I get it. But then I started working. It's like, you know, I started working again. And let me tell you, I think it was the very first time I went to work like all day, and I came home. And I came in and the kids were like, yeah, we need this undone. I'm like, oh, like I could just feel like this anger, like, wait, are you serious? So it's something that I knew conceptually that, yeah, that probably would be annoying, right? But when it happened to me, I was like, hold on a second, now I know what she was talking about. Yeah, so now our kids know, we've we've talked to them about it enough where they know that, and it almost becomes like this joke now. So anytime me or her come home, they're like, how was your day? How's it going? Or like, it was great. What do you need? And I'm like, okay, good. We got covered. But yeah, so it might be coming home for you. So like, yeah, so what this worksheet I hope does is kind of just bring some awareness to certain situations, and you might even notice that maybe what happens, you just notice this consistency is maybe if you skip lunch, you tend to have these really bad interactions with people in the afternoon. Or maybe if you did the opposite, maybe if you have like this late night snack, maybe you're like sending texts or posting on social media late at night, and you're like, why did I do that? I should be asleep. What am I doing? Okay, let's move on to the back page, the last page. So now this is where you're, instead of being reflective, we're trying to be a little bit prescriptive here. So if this situation were to happen again, here are a couple of questions that you can ask yourself. You know, what can you stop noticing? You know, maybe you notice this person's, you know, the way that they look at you, just, you don't like it, you know, or the way that they, whatever it is, the way they cross their legs, or the way that they sit in their chair, it just irks you. Well, maybe you just stop noticing that. What are some things you can start noticing? Maybe you can notice that, hey, they actually come to work on time, and you know, or they do something positive. So what can you stop noticing? What can you start noticing? Then when we get to the brain is, how can you change that story? How can you change what you tell yourself you need to do, you want to do, you should do? How can you reframe the story? Or even look at the story as a way of developing resilience. There's this really great company, it's called Despair, and they have all these like funny posters. So they're supposed to look like these inspirational posters, but they're not. And one of my favorite ones, it's a picture of the Titanic. And it says, what if your life was meant, like, what if the purpose of your life was meant to serve as an example for others? It's like, well, that's one way to look at it. Like, hey, your life had a purpose to it, making sure people don't do what you did. And then your behavior, like, so how would, if you were able to reframe this story, if you were to change what you notice, change the story, how would that change your behavior? Now, of course, this is all speculative, right? But this is just a part of the process. This is going to help you, I hope, decide in advance. So you might say, hey, I know that my kids are going to ask me for something when I get home. Maybe instead of it really ticking me off, maybe I just say, look, that's going to happen. So this is kind of what I did with the whole lights. It's like, I know when I see lights on, like, this is ridiculous. But I can decide in advance that, you know what, my story about it is going to be a little different. I'm now using this as a practice of patience. I'm using this as a way of saying, hey, look at that. There's another thing I don't like, but I'm not going to respond to it. It gives me another practice. Okay, so let's spend about 5 minutes or so and fill out these questions here on this third sheet. Okay. Would anyone want to share? You don't necessarily even have to share about like your particulars or your story, just about this exercise and any thoughts that you have.
I think for me, like, as I mentioned, I know that I think we all know that we don't interact as well when we're tired, when we're not feeling well, when those things happen. Being able to use these tools to create that space between the trigger and the response is the practice that we need to focus on. In the situation that I was in, the meeting that I was having, the topic has been in play for about a year now. As we all know, things can drag on for a really long time.
Yeah.
We don't think it should be a quick fix, but suddenly it's a year later. So the topic was one that is just continuing to drag on. So that, coupled with my not feeling well, led me to react in a way that the message I was giving was not inappropriate. The way I delivered the message was inappropriate. And if I had been more aware of some of the questions that are on this page, my message would have been delivered in a way that I was more proud of. Because again, the message, I was fine with the message. I wasn't fine with the presentation, and that after effect of, oh gosh, I diluted my message because of the presentation. So it wasn't as effective as it could have been had I delivered it in a more mindful, more responsive way. And so I think these kinds of worksheets are very good in helping us to create that space, that from stimulus to response. And so I think that's, from the worksheet perspective, I think it's a really good tool for that.
Thanks. Anything else? Yeah, what I think is helpful is that you want to look at reality. Sometimes somebody might say, I have this situation. You're like, well, if that were me, this is what I would have done. Like, well, you have no idea. Let's talk about what you did. And only you know all the answers to these questions. Only you know what you were feeling and what you were thinking. And so I think it's helpful for us to ground our awareness in our lived experience. The last thing I would say is that this is just a tool to try and experiment. And the concept is progress, not perfection. This tool is not meant to go, man, I blew it. I really, really blew it. You probably knew that you didn't do a good job already. This is not to prepare you to be perfect the next time. This is just to say, okay, let me bring some awareness to it, so that maybe, like you said, maybe that next time, instead of it being stimulus response, instead it's just, wait, I spent some time thinking about, maybe it's because I'm not feeling well. And even Grace talked about that when she was here in October. She's like, she used the concept of a window of tolerance. And she said some organizations that she's gone into and talked about it, they now use that as part of their vernacular. They say, I'm outside of my window. Give me a couple of minutes and we can have this conversation. And so anyway, you now have this little worksheet, and this is a little cheat sheet for you, Blake, because this is going to be our next relationship experiment for class.
Great.
So
Perfect.
you get to work ahead of time if you want. Thank you for coming. And our next session will be March 6th.
Yes.
All right, March 6th. And my friend Grace is coming. It's very exciting. So she's going to come and do our talk. She's a clinical psychologist and a yoga therapist and a researcher and a scientist and all this great stuff. So she'll be here if you could join us March 6th. That would be great.